Hey, everybody, and welcome back to Sorry I Missed This. Today, we're going to be having some hard conversations because today we are talking about resolving conflict. I just wanted to know, what do we do about it, right? How do we learn those skills in the first place? Where do those skills come from? And so to do that, I'm so excited to introduce you to Michael McNulty. He's our guest today. Michael is the founder of the Chicago Relationship Center and an advanced trainer for the Gottman Institute. He works with couples to help resolve conflicts, resolve resentments, and grow their relationships into something healthier and stronger. And so I'm so excited to have him today. I hate conflict. I hate it. I will do anything and everything in my power to avoid conflict, up to agreeing to things that I didn't do or didn't say, just to be like, yeah, you know what? I did do that and I'm so sorry, just to end the conversation. And that's not healthy, dear listener. And so when I started learning about ADHD, when I started learning about how ADHD and executive functioning differences and emotional regulation and all of those things tie into our ability to resolve conflict, I was frankly really surprised. And like, I've been doing this for a while, but it kind of makes sense, right? Like, what happens in conflict? Somebody gets mad at somebody else. Maybe you said something or did something or forgot something or said you were going to do something and forgot to do it or promised that you would or whatever it may be. And so I find that inadvertently, even though I'm a very conflict averse person, I often find myself in conflicts because, I don't want to say because of, but in relation to my ADHD. And that shows up a lot in my relationship with my husband. And I know that there have been times where I have been unkind and uncompassionate and unwilling to listen because of that emotional dysregulation. But the thing that I always get asked, and the thing that I have to think about, and I think that we as ADHDers have a responsibility to sort of puzzle out in our brain, is when is it an explanation and when does it become an excuse? How do we, as people with ADHD, take responsibility for our actions, act compassionately and kindly to the people around us, and find ways to support our executive functioning and our emotional regulation and all of that in the throes of conflict? Before I introduce you to Michael, I want to say one more thing. If you are a person who is afraid of conflict, who runs from conflict, it's okay. There are skills and there are things that you can do to learn to be a better self-advocate. You don't have to bend over backwards to please people. You don't have to bend over backwards to avoid the negative implications of conflict, because sometimes conflict can be healthy and conflict can be useful and conflict can be powerful. And that is why I'm so excited to bring you this conversation today, because I think avoiding conflict or working our whole lives to never get into any fights ever, it's also doing ourselves a disservice. So it's complicated, it's nuanced, but I hope that you learn a little bit of something today here on Sorry I Missed This. Thank you so much for being here, Michael.
Oh, Cate, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm so excited to talk to you. But before we start, I want to let our listeners know, if you haven't heard of the Gottman Institute, Michael, I think you'll agree, it's a pretty big deal. Yeah?
Yeah, it sure is. Yeah. Yeah.
So the Gottman Method for healthy relationships is a form of couples-based therapy and education for couples therapists. And it specifically derives from the relationship research of psychologist John Gottman. So the goals of the Gottman Method are really interesting because they're to disarm conflicting verbal communication, increase intimacy, respect, and affection, remove barriers that create a feeling of stagnancy, and create a heightened sense of empathy and understanding within the context of the relationship. And yes, I got those off the website and I read them to you, dear listener, because I can't remember that much stuff. But so anyway, Michael, the Gottman Method is fascinating because it seems like it's really couched in good, clear communication while also being couched in kindness and empathy. Can you talk to me a little bit about it?
We have to remember that John Gottman really was the first person to study relationships back in 1972 when he and his collaborator, Dr. Bob Levinson, began to study relationships. And part of why they did this was because at the time, there were like 6 studies. There were about 1,000 studies, but only about 6 of them were statistically meaningful. And the biggest finding was that women who are well dressed are more likely to divorce. And that was all the information that was out there at the time.
What?
And so people had these schools of thoughts around how to manage, couples and help couples, how to treat couples. And they were doing things that were just so not helpful, that really went against what the research tells us now, helps couples. Like, for instance, one guy who, George Bach, who wrote the book, The Intimate Enemy, and he had his couples come in and use these foam bats to kind of hit each other to express their anger at each other. So one would say, you're not taking out the trash, and they'd whack. And then the other person might say, we're not having enough sex, whack. And it was all based on the idea that if people could get angry, it would be cathartic and the folks would be closer. But the reality is that the research tells us that anger, releasing anger isn't necessarily cathartic. And so it was all based in something that wasn't true. And yet it was very popular at the time. These bats are called, I think, batakas. And every once in a while, they'll pop up on a TV show or something, and you'll see them. But John was very, very concerned, and Bob was too, his collaborator. And so they decided to very systematically look at couples and why relationships succeed and fail. And as they did, what they discovered was that conflict is ongoing in a relationship for the most part. So what they found was that 69% of the issues that come up between partners are perpetual issues or perpetual problems. So the easily solved issues only happen like 31% of the time.
That freaks me out though a little bit, because 69%, that's a lot. That's a lot of the time. So is that something that if I'm in a relationship that might be struggling, does that mean that we're doomed to failure? Does that mean that we're totally screwed?
No, it's not all doom and gloom. It's just the way that it is. Basically, if people are in dialogue about their conflict, even when they have perpetual conflict, if people are in dialogue, a respectful dialogue where everyone's feeling understood and everyone's feeling appreciated, then they're fine. It's when people get gridlocked. It's when the conversations turn very, very negative. And what happens is people know, oh gosh, that issue is coming up. This is going to go nowhere good, and so they use poor communication. They get physiologically aroused, or what we call flooded. Their heartbeat beats go up above 100 beats per minute. They have these other symptoms that are characteristic of fight or flight. And it's when people have too many gridlock problems over time that's when they're more at risk of ending a long-term love relationship. But if they can shift the gridlock into dialogue, then they generally do okay. So the information is actually very hopeful, because a lot of people come in thinking, gosh, is it me? Is it this hard? Should there be this many differences? And the answer is yes, there are that many differences, and that's pretty typical, but no one seems to know that. People seem to think that like 80% of the time it should be straightforward, and that's just not the case.
What are the types of things that we are talking about in terms of that 69% of disagreement? Are we talking about who takes out the garbage? Are we talking about how much sex should we have? Are we talking about what religion should we raise our kids in? Like, what are the sticking points for couples?
This is all of the above. I mean, everything you just mentioned would fit into that category. It's really any issue that has to do with the two partners managing their life together. One person might be wanting to send a child to a parochial school, where the other person wants to send a child to a public school. One person may be a spender and another person may be a saver. And these are the kinds of things that people don't really get to know about each other until they get really into the relationship and to really share a life together. One of the people I did not mention, at a certain point after John and Bob did their research and, developed their mathematical model, which predicts whether or not partners will divorce or remain together or separate or remain together. Julie Gottman asked John Gottman, And she said, John, have you ever considered to do anything that would help people with this research? And John basically said, no, I don't want to do anything to help people with this. And then he always jokes and he says they compromised and together they developed this theory because that. But he was leery because there was so much bad couples therapy out there. But Julie is like an amazing therapist, an outstanding therapist too, and knew couples really well. And so the two of them took all the research and developed this method to be able to help partners. And part of it is working on friendship, part of it's working on conflict, part of it is working on establishing a meaningful relationship.
One of the major tenets of the Gottman Method is that couples require, I'm going to read it off my piece of paper so I don't get it wrong, 5 times more positive interactions than negative. With the thought being that negative emotions like defensiveness and contempt hurt a relationship more than positive ones heal, which is why we shouldn't be bopping each other with bats if we get mad, right? But so I'm curious about how this works in context with ADHD, particularly when we start to talk about how ADHD can affect emotional regulation and that sense of flooding and that sense of gridlock.
What John and Bob did with their research was that they set up a lab at Indiana University in 1972, and they developed, this research protocol where basically couples would come in and they'd have a conflict discussion and an everyday discussion that was all video taped. They'd look at the behaviors that were occurring, body language, and it turns out that the people who are really doing well with relationship had 5 times as many positive things going on in terms of body language and statements. And they were surprised by that finding because really that means there has to be a whole lot of positivity to be able to be in dialogue and to be effective in terms of working with their problems together. And so that's where that statistic comes from.
Yeah.
And so it's just important to remember that friendship and a very positive connection really help in relationship. You're always going to have conflict. And you have to be doing things each week, each day really, that sort of promote friendship and positivity. And those can't stop because people are in conflict. People just have to think of conflict as a fact of life, and that's how it works.
It's so interesting to me to hear you talk about this idea of conflict just sometimes has to exist in a room. And that can be so hard for women, especially with ADHD, because we deal a lot with stuff like rejection sensitivity. We deal a lot with this idea that we have to be fixers. We have to deal with it immediately. And so a lot of studies have shown that especially late diagnosed women with ADHD, we tend to be people pleasers. We tend to have this like immediate need that if anything bad is going on, we have to fix it right away, or like the danger signals start sort of flooding out of us.
Right. And if that isn't discovered and understood, then the partners can really be very lost. The type of woman that you're referring to can grow more and more resentful and more depleted. If someone is neurodivergent in a relationship, and someone's neurotypical, or 2 people are together and they have two different forms of neurodivergence, they do better if they can accept, their neurodivergence and try to work with it in the relationship and talk about like what's difficult and why. And if those discussions can be had, often the level of understanding between the partners becomes much richer, and people are better positioned to support one another rather than, misunderstanding and thinking their partner's just being difficult or being lazy or they're kind of nuts or something like that, which is the go-to places when people don't understand what's really going on.
Well, I love that you highlighted that why, because the question I get all the time is how do I explain what is going on with my ADHD without making it an excuse? Right. And I think that because as ADHDers, I really do believe like we have a responsibility to try and do our best. We have a responsibility to make life as good as we possibly can for the people in our life. And that means sometimes we have to take responsibility. But also the fact of the matter is that sometimes taking responsibility means, hey, we need a little bit of extra support. Yeah. And so this idea of talking through the why is it hard for me? Why is it that that then sort of leads to actually what I wanted to talk about next, which I love, which is executive functioning and how executive functioning shows up in ADHD and how that can affect our ability to resolve conflict.
Basically, with executive functioning, we think about things like flexible thinking, self-monitoring, planning and prioritizing, task initiation, organization, impulse control. I read this article by Russell Barkley a couple of weeks ago, and he was making the point that when you're assessing for ADD, the ADD assessments are helpful because they let people know that they have it, but probably an executive functioning assessment would be even more helpful, because people would really be able to break down what's truly hard for them.
I feel that in my very soul, Michael. I feel that in my soul. I've been attacked on my own podcast. Oh my gosh.
And so, and that has implications both for, I think you're referring to like how you talk about things, and also, how you compensate, which I think has to be part of the discussion. And I think before we even go any further, it's important to remember that the reason that the term neurodiversity was brought about was that, to really emphasize strengths and to emphasize differences rather than pathology or something like that, or disorders.
Yeah, the deficit mindset.
Yeah, and so like all these same women who are struggling have these unique gifts, as well. And, there's a lot of creativity there, there's a capacity to hyper focus when someone gets into something. And sometimes, if people have talents and they hyper focus, their success can be, off the charts. But if people can, be aware of those differences and know how to work with them, it just makes life so much more workable.
The other one that comes up a lot that I don't hear talked about very often is just time perception. How people with ADHD have differences in time perception, both just sort of like as we move through our normal day, but then also you bring in that hyper-focus, hyper-fixation mindset. Because right now I'm long distance from my husband while I'm out here in LA. And I know that I tend to carry a lot of guilt about how often I'll forget to text him or like, oh my gosh, it's been 4 days since I called him because I've been hyper-focused on the work that I'm doing out there. And that can also really impact a relationship and especially impact the other person and how safe they're feeling in the relationship.
Well, that is so true. That basically what can happen is that someone can be preoccupied with something, and not even realize that hours have passed. And, perhaps they're supposed to be connecting with their partner, and then their partner can feel like, do I matter? What's up with that?
But that perfectly then aligns with this idea that the Gottmans developed of turning away and turning towards and how to initiate that discussion. So before we talk about that, can you explain to our dear, wonderful listeners what turning away, turning towards is?
Turning towards involves one person making a bid for connection, and it could be a small thing like you and your husband or at a family reunion, and you see a goofy aunt do something really funny, and so you might smile and look at him and he would smile back. You made a bid, he turned towards the bid. It's a bid made and received. And what John would say, Dr. John Gottman would say that basically, every time a bid is made and received, it's like a positive deposit in the emotional bank account of the relationship. Like small scale bids that happen in everyday living, like, hey, I got to tell you a joke, I got to tell you a story, I want a hug. And then there's medium sized bids, like let's have a date night, or it's been a while since, we've gone to the shore or something like that. Let's go. And then there's even big bids like, I've always wanted to take a trip to Hawaii with you. Let's do it for our 25th anniversary. The same thing holds true with all bids of all sizes, that the other person can either turn towards the bid and connect, and they build up the positive deposits in the bank account. They can miss the bid. And really people with ADHD are, you have to be careful about bids, because if you're preoccupied with a bunch of other stuff, or if you're having a hard time paying attention, it's that much easier to miss bids.
Well, that's what I was going to say, is that I absolutely see a pattern even in my own life. The acknowledgement of the bid, but not following through, where it's like, hey, I really want to go to the beach this weekend. Oh my gosh, we totally should. But by the time Friday or Saturday rolls around, I've forgotten or my schedule has changed or something like that. Because, you know, in my brain, I'm like, time is wibbly wobbly. And so I feel how my own ADHD often impacts my ability to really authentically turn towards and accept those bids all the way.
You know, in the Gottman Method, we have a protocol called the aftermath of a regrettable incident, and so that can be used for when partners have an argument and they need to kind of repair with each other and figure out what happened, and everyone can take some responsibility for what happened and then come up with a plan for next time. So sometimes it's the processing of experience which becomes so important. If that goes untalked about, then your partner's not going to understand why it happened and what happened. And so again, if people can talk about their ongoing issues, their perpetual issues, they can learn from that and figure out how to work together over time to meet both partners' needs.
So we know that turning towards is really important. Embracing those bids is really important. We know that approaching conflict with empathy and kindness and a positive mindset is really important. So once we have all that and we've sort of absorbed all that, what stops people from successfully resolving conflict?
There can be a number of things. If they're not tending to their friendship together well enough, that stops people. You know, so really with the friendship, there's 3 levels. One is love maps, which means knowing your partner. You know, and so and when you're in a relationship with someone who's neurodivergent, you know, and when you're neurodivergent and in a relationship, you have to know your partner that much more. Then we also have to appreciate our partners, you know, regularly and express appreciation, not just kind of think it, we've got to say it. We also have to connect with our partners, which is the turning towards peace. And when people do all 3 of those things well, then they have a good, strong friendship. And so there's a lot of positive deposits in the emotional bank account of the relationship, and you can withdraw from there when things get off track. But then conflict also is, you know, how we manage conflict. What happens when things break down is people, you know, use what John would call the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, which are the biggest predictors of divorce.
Talk to me about these 4 horsemen.
Okay, will do. So the first one is criticism. You know, that's like when you're trying to make a complaint to your partner, but you maybe have held on to it too long, and you start using these you statements that come off as blaming. Maybe you've tried to justify your concern to work your way up to talking about it. So that would be like, you never take out the trash. You know, you don't care about me. I'm the only one who cares about this house. I'm the only one who takes out the trash ever. Never in the history of since I've known you have you ever taken out the trash. You know, that kind of stuff. And
But instantly, it's so interesting to me because instantly, I see where the ADHD, emotional dysregulation, that time perception, that even like the hyperbole that we can sometimes engage in, where something feels like you never take out the trash, and it's like, no, you forget a lot, but you know, like you have done it before. But then the partner hears, well, that's factually inaccurate because of course I have taken out the trash before. I just sometimes forget.
I think particularly like living with ADD and trying to cover one's bases is really stressful. And so when people are in a stressful place, they often have like a negative perspective that can come out in terms of when they try to communicate with others. And I think that's when they're more at risk of coming off as critical. There's an antidote for each of these 4 horsemen, and the antidote, you know, the thing to do instead that really works. I mean, they're simple concepts, but they really help. The first antidote is to use soft startup, you know, complain without blame. And so you use a template that's basically, I feel about what and I need, you know. So I get so frustrated when I come home and, you know, I worked before I left to make sure everything was clean. And then when you forget to take out the trash, it changes everything. The place just looks a lot worse, and I need things to be clean and organized and tidy to be able to think and function. And so I really need you to remember to take out the trash. That's really important to me. So did you hear how that sounds different from the you statements. Instead, you're using I statements to talk about your feelings and needs. You can use a you statement to talk about what happened because it's like an event, but then you have to shift to I statements and just own your feelings, own your needs. And then you're not calling your partner out in the same way. And usually you can be much better heard.
Well, and it's also an opportunity to engage in empathy. Your partner might not know, I really do need a clean, quiet space to work. Otherwise, it's really difficult for me. And so hearing that, as opposed to you never take out the trash, that might suddenly click something of, oh, this isn't necessarily about the action of taking out the garbage. This is about creating a space where we can live and work together as our best selves.
Right.
Okay, what is the second horseman of the relationship apocalypse, Michael? Go.
So the second one is defensiveness. So, suppose like you had said something to me that came off as critical. Then what often happens is people get defensive. And that can either be kind of a whiny sort of, you're always picking on me, you're never happy, you don't care about me. Another form of defensiveness is like a counterattack. And that can be like, I have taken out the trash every single day since I met you and every single day since we moved in together. And you know that, or something like that, where it's not, I am not the problem. You are the one who doesn't care about this house. The danger is, you can imagine, if you get into that, then it just goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth.
Forever.
Yeah. And it's a horrible track to be on. And the antidote to that is to be able to accept some responsibility for something. So like if you complain to me about something, and even if you're coming off as a little bit critical, if I say anything that accepts a little responsibility, like if I say, I haven't been that great about it. I'm not saying you're right. I've never taken out the trash in my life or something like that. I don't know where the trash cans are outside the house. But if I don't have to say that, but if I could just say, I could be better at that. Often what happens is the other person will kind of calm down.
I think that makes a ton of sense. So then I guess my next question is, what is the third horseman of the relationship apocalypse?
Well, the third one is contempt. And contempt is kind of the funnest one to describe, but it's like ramped up criticism, and where the person is really feeling negatively about their partner. Without knowing it, they're scanning for the negative to the extent that they're just trying to find everything that their partner is doing wrong. They've gotten entirely away of talking about their feelings and their needs. And basically people act superior to their partner when they're contemptuous. They act disgusted with their partner. The eye roll is like the biggest nonverbal sign of contempt, or the sneer is a big sign of contempt as well. And the problem with contempt is it's like pouring acid on love. Every time you do it, you kill a little more love. And if there's too much contempt over time, sometimes people reach a point where there's no love left. And that's like the biggest predictor of divorce. It looks different in different cultures. Like in the South, if you hear someone say, bless his heart or bless her heart, you can count on the fact that they just said something contemptuous. Like if they say like, he is just as dumb as a box of rocks, then bless his heart. In Ireland, I taught this stuff there with my colleague Sinead. And I remember we asked the group there, what does contempt look like? And they would say, something like, it's just amazing that you have that PhD, Michael, particularly given that wee house that you grew up in, or that family that you come from. It's like the backhanded slam, and so, you have to be aware of how contempt works in the cultures that have influenced you, and in your own culture, to be able to work with it. And there's also like, I would call it like good boy or good girl contempt, where they say something like, I grew up in a house where we just believed in taking out the trash. we thought when we did so, we prevent rodents from coming in. We live better. We keep our things at our home the way we want to keep it. That's just the kind of people we were and the values that we have, but the whole inference is, and you weren't raised that
And you
way.
don't.
Yeah. And so those are all different forms of contempt, but that's one you've got to be the most careful about.
All right. So what do we do about it then? What is the antidote?
Well, the
antidote.
This is also why appreciation is so important. So, if you work with the friendship and you're appreciating your partner regularly, and you're trying to keep the positive things your partner's doing in mind, that really helps. What happens too, though, is that, again, as I said before, when people are using contempt, they've gotten entirely away from talking about their feelings and their needs, and they're just trying to nail their partner. So they have to get back to diligently talking about their feelings and their needs and not talking about their partner. Just what's happening, what do they feel about it? What do they need instead? Really extra diligence around soft startup.
I guess then, okay, so what's the next one? What's the fourth horseman of the apocalypse?
Oh, and the final one is stonewalling. And so that might, and I think with ADHD, where that would happen, or really any of this, the three differences that I focus on mostly at this point are dyslexia, being on the spectrum, or ADHD. Sometimes what happens is that when people are not responding to a conversation, they're not engaging, their arms may be crossed, their body language is closed. It's just making their partner nuts because it feels to them like, that what they're saying is not important to the other partner who is stonewalling. But the real thing that's going on is that usually people are overwhelmed, and even they're physiologically flooded, their heart rates might be even up above 100, or they're moving in that direction, and they have those other symptoms that occur when people are experiencing fight or flight. And that's because they don't quite know how to respond to the conversation. And what they need to do is to tell their partner they're overwhelmed, to take a break, relax, and then come back and try again.
Is that the antidote then? Is just taking a break, taking a step away, emotionally regulating?
Yes, it's the antidote. It's called soothing and includes all the things that you just described. And it can be whatever works for you. Like if watching a favorite sitcom for a half hour will really do the trick, that's okay. If it's taking a walk or doing some yoga, or anything that helps, that's they're all good.
Wise, smart, amazing words from Michael McNulty, who is the founder of the Chicago Relationship Center and is also an advanced trainer for the Gottman Institute. Michael, tell the people where they can find you, where they can learn more, how to get a hold of you. Give us the dirty details.
Okay. So they can look at my website, which is chicagorelationshipcenter.com. That's one place to see what I'm doing. And then they can also go to the events calendar on Gottman.com, where what I'm doing is listed, and then what all my colleagues are doing is listed as well. And I teach, besides doing weekly couples therapy, I teach the Gottman Method to couples through the art and science of love in Chicago and in Oakland with my partner, Sinead Smith, who's my partner in that endeavor, not my partner in life. I
was like, oh, that's so romantic. But okay, that makes sense too.
And then I also teach all levels of the Gottman training, sometimes at the University of Chicago and sometimes at other places. So the other thing that I do with the Gottman Institute is, 3 or 4 times a year, they sponsor webinars, lunchtime webinars, where we talk about all these concepts and how to adapt the Gottman Method for people who are neurodiverse. And so some are for couples, some are for therapists, and that's another place to look for me too.
All right. Well, I will be signing up for that. And if you would like to join me, come on down, listeners. But all right, Michael, thank you so much for being here. This was such an educational and important conversation. I really appreciate your time.
Well, I would just say, Cate, that you inspire me. This was just such a great conversation, and so easy and so interesting, and it's all driven by you. So thank you.
Aw, thanks so much. That's nice. I will turn towards your kindness and give it right back to you because you're great too. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you the next time. Bye. Thank you for listening. Anything mentioned in the episode will be linked in the show notes with more resources. Have a question, comment, burning story you'd like to share? Email me at sorryimissedthis@understood.org. This show is brought to you by understood.org. Understood is a nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering people with learning and thinking differences like ADHD and dyslexia. Learn more at understood.org. Sorry I Missed This is produced and edited by Jessamine Molly and Margie DeSantis. Our theme music was written by Justin D. Wright, who also mixes the show. Alana Milner is our supervising producer. Brianna Berry is our production director. Neil Drumming is our editorial director. For Understood.org, our executive directors are Laura Key, Scott Koshier, and Seth Melnick. I'm your host, Kate Osborne. Thank you so much for listening. Remember to be kind to yourself, remember to be kind to others, and I'll see you again soon.